They don't come here to attack us because we're rich and we're free. They come and they attack us because we're over there.
We don't need to go populist left or populist right. We don't need to embrace neo-Marxism or neo-fascism, these disastrous movements from the 20th century. Turns out the answer is pretty much our Bill of Rights, our story. Embrace freedom. That's the answer.
And if the LP has a purpose, it's not to put people to sleep. It's to wake them up.
We're here because we love liberty, and we're here because we hate injustice. We are here to save mankind. We are here to fight.
Join us, the Libertarian Party, in perhaps the most exciting, grandest endeavor in history, the restoration of American liberty.
Ideas spread, they can't stop them. An idea whose time has come cannot be stopped by any army or any government.
Hello and welcome to episode 70 of Decentralized Revolution, a podcast from the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus and Mises PAC. I'm Aaron Harris and I'm your host. I have an apology to make. This rather long hiatus took about twice as long as I had intended when I decided to take one back in December for the holidays. Nothing wrong, just kind of life gets in the way sometimes. But as you hear this, I'm editing 2 other episodes that I've already recorded, and we're trying to schedule some pretty big live episodes with some pretty huge guests that I hope I'll be able to tell you about soon. The idea is to go live on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, kind of leverage the big audiences of the guests that we're going to book. So we'll get a big audience ahead of time. And then also afterward, we're really trying to drive people to our mailing list at takehumanaction.com. We've got like 50,000 pretty hard followers on all those socials, I think. I could be off. Don't quote me on that. We've got 17,000 or so names on our email list, which is awesome. We get a really good open rate on those emails. I don't think it's because I write most of them. I think it's because people are really jazzed about what we're doing with the Mises Caucus. So we want to get those people who kind of know about us to get on that mailing list so they can find out how to get involved at the local level, how to get involved at the Reno convention coming up. So that's why we're going to do those live episodes, to just try to increase our reach and get the ideas out there. Those of us on the Mises Caucus board, we've had a lot on our plates recently, not complaining at all. We're excited about the Libertarian Party National Convention, which it's coming up, scheduled for Reno, Nevada. And that's how you pronounce it, by the way. It's Nevada, not Nevada. It's going to happen in Reno, Nevada over Memorial Day weekend. You can stay up to date by signing up for that email list. So go to takehumanaction.com, or you can use the link at the show notes page for this episode at decentralizedrevolution.com/70. That's decentralizedrevolution.com/70. Plus, I'll have a more extensive kind of update on what's going on with the various state conventions and the run up to the national convention on our next episode 71, which is where I'm going to talk to Dave Casey of the Delaware Mises Caucus. He is also the man behind the online brand known as Dave versus Goliath. He's got a great podcast. He does a lot of memes and videos. He's just a really great guy, and he gave me a lot of help when I started this podcast. He's the guy who does our intro and outro music, which I love. Some people kind of make fun of it, but I think it's really great, and I'll fight you on that. So you can go to decentralizedrevolution.com/70 again to find links on how you can get on our email list and to find out more about today's guest, and that's Doug Stewart of the Libertarian Christian Institute. He's one of 4 co-authors of a book called Faith Seeking Freedom, Libertarian Christian Answers to Tough Questions. And I had 2 of the other guests, authors of that book as guests on this show back on episode 41. Kerry Baldwin and Dick Clark from the Libertarian Christian Institute. talked at length about the book, and it's a really good book. I got to read it right, I think, before it came out, and it's definitely worth checking out if you're interested in either one of those things, libertarianism or Christianity. And we talked to Doug a little bit about it on the show today. Plus, I wanted to talk about social justice and critical race theory with him. He was on Bob Murphy's podcast a few months ago, I think with Carrie and maybe Dick too. I think 2 or 3 of them were on that show. And Doug mentioned that he had an interest in social justice from the libertarian perspective, and that's a term that both in the political world, the academic world, and in the Christian world, it kind of means different things to different people. And I wanted to talk to someone who had his head on straight about that. And Doug definitely does, both as a libertarian and, in my opinion, as a Christian. Of course, you don't have to be a Christian to listen to this. That's not what this is about. I don't hide the fact that I'm one of those people, but we're here to talk about liberty and whatever we can do to promote that. And Doug has some really good things to say. I know you're going to enjoy this episode, and I want others to hear it too. So I asked Doug, and he offered to help us with a way to help promote this episode of Decentralized Revolution, plus to get the word out about the Libertarian Christian Institute and the book. Before I go any further, there's a disclaimer. The LCI, they're a non-political educational organization. They don't endorse candidates or issues. They're not affiliated with the Mises Caucus, the LP. They're not telling you to vote for us or them or whatever. I wanted to make that clear. Doug, we're just talking ideas. And to get some of those ideas that he's working on out there, there's a link where else on the show notes page at decentralizedrevolution.com/70. Actually, there's 2 links. You can use one of the links to get 50% off the audiobook of Faith Seeking Freedom. And there'll be a link telling you how you can tweet a link to the show notes page, or you can retweet the post from the Mises Caucus Twitter account when they make the post about this episode of Decentralized Revolution. If you do that, we'll put you in a drawing for a chance to, you'll have a chance to win a box full of 5 paper copies of Faith Seeking Freedom. All 5 copies will go to one person. That person can then distribute them however he or she or they like. See, I'm pronoun friendly there. So details of all that, show notes page, decentralizedrevolution.com/70. I think you'll enjoy what Doug Stewart has to say here. Welcome to the show, Doug Stewart. You're the CEO of the Libertarian Christian Institute. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
That's good. I've wanted to have you on for a while. A year or so ago, I had on Carrie and Dick, who also were the co-authors on Faith Seeking Freedom. So why don't you kind of update us on how, and when I did, the book was either not out or just barely out. So how is that book doing? How has it helped what you guys are doing at the Libertarian Christian Institute?
Yeah, so the book is Faith Seeking Freedom. It's a nice yellow cover with blue text that's really large, and you can get a copy at libertarianchristians.com. I'm pretty sure you would have had an interview with them in 2021. So the book was out in November of 2020, and we got a little bit of a slow start in promoting it and kind of getting it out there. But it's like building momentum, and we've gotten so much positive feedback about it. There's been a lot of people that have said they've just kind of kept it nearby because they often get the kind of questions that are in the book, which I'll explain what kind of content it is here in a minute. But the feedback that we're getting is like, this has really helped me sort of clarify my thoughts. It's also been really good for me to give to my past. We had some guy give it. He bought a whole bunch of copies for all the elders in his church. Incidentally, they actually asked him to preach on a relevant topic that a libertarian should preach on at the pulpit. So that's kind of cool that he got to do that. So there are a number of people who've said, I've given this to people and it's enhanced our ability to have conversations together. The book itself is basically, I don't want to undersell it as a glorified Q&A, but it is 102 questions, I believe, that are divided up into about 10 to 12 chapters on that are topical, and starting from the basics of libertarianism to some basics of basic economics, to abortion, to immigration, to nationalism, patriotism. We even open up with a chapter on like why should a Christian even care about politics, because we want to sort of head that off at the gate with respect to people thinking, well, why should I care about what a libertarian says about faith and so forth. So it's not very long. It's about 125 pages, and but it's definitely been useful for a lot of people. Oh, I should also mention that our original plan was to call it something like 100 questions in 100 words or less, and as we began writing, we realized that's not going to work.
100 words
well, and the idea would be, can you give an answer at a water cooler at your office? Well, that kind of went out the window by the end of 2020. There's no water coolers ever anymore, if you're in the city. So it's like, all right, how do we? I'm sort of joking there, but we ended up realizing that 200 to 250 words is about right. So each answer is about that long. The exception would be the abortion chapter, which is a little bit more extensive. We kind of fudged it on that, but we kept it under 200 and elsewhere. So we worked really hard at keeping to that. So these are not lengthy answers. These are succinct. They've been reviewed by each other internally and by our editors, so that we can sort of have a really good succinct outcome.
Yeah, it's good. It's good just for that reason, because it's funny, especially sort of online debates and stuff. I saw a tweet the other day where someone was pushing back on something a libertarian said, and they're like, I want a more substantive answer, but don't give me a book to read, because they don't want like a long book. And so you could, on a specific issue, just give them one page or less than a page of this, and at least it would provide them some direction as to how to think about it and where to look. So I think that's valuable, to put things in bite-sized pieces.
Yeah. Well, and another note is that we've tried to keep it as conversational in tone as possible, because we knew that we would end up publishing an audiobook for it, which we have. That came out in late summer of 2021. So there's an audiobook that you can download, same website. And you can also get it on Audible as well. So we wanted to make the questions and answers conversational. So if all you did was look through the table of contents and you read the questions, which is basically the section or chapter headings or whatever, you would sort of even sense then, even without reading the answers, that there's like a conversation happening, and there's the in between the lines. And of course, what we want you to see is what's in between those lines, right? Because you open up the book and you see the actual answer.
Yeah, there is kind of it's organized well. So I really appreciate that about it. I wanted to talk to you basically a lot about social justice and what that means, especially because it's driving a lot of policy. But I want to just talk just a couple of minutes about, COVID and all this, especially from, I think that as a Christian, sometimes you see people, there's been a lot of, people posting editorials or letters to the editor of people writing from a Christian perspective, and not to question anyone's faith or anything like that. I'm not doing that. But like there is sort of a smug tone of, well, if you want to show love for your neighbor, you need to, follow this prescription of the government, X, Y, or Z. And it's kind of hard to give an answer to that without sounding, I think they phrase things that way to make it sound like, well, you're just a jerk if you even take up the question. So, and I know it's loaded. Yeah, so I noticed on the Libertarian Christians website that there's you guys have done a little work on that. There's a pop-up to say, hey, join our list and get some info about this, I think. So tell us about how the Institute there has handled it, and I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, no, it's all good. Yeah, it's like the moral high ground is inherent in the statement. You have to do X, Y, or Z things or habits in public in order to be considered as somebody who loves their neighbor. And so it's kind of, it sort of reminds me, I'm gonna I'm going to upset a few of my friends on Christian friends with this statement. But when someone says something along the lines of, I have a high view of scripture, what they mean is something that's not just, I have a high value of scripture. They mean that, but they have these like other things that come along with it. That it's like, if you don't affirm those things, you must not have a high view of scripture.
Yeah.
And so it's the same idea here, where you have Christians who say, we really, really want to love our neighbor. And we really want to show love to our neighbor. And that show love is, well, we have to demonstrate it. And in order to demonstrate it, you have to think deliberately, and you have to choose to either put on a mask or to vaccinate, or whatever the choice they think is the action that's visible in public. And now, of course, we're venturing into things like virtue signaling or grandstanding in some ways. And most of these people, I don't think, are doing that. I think they take a little bit of pleasure in knowing that people see them as that way, but I think that's just human. I'm not going to fault them too much for that. But it's very, I would say, narrow-minded to believe that simply putting on a mask or getting vaccinated for the sake of other people is the only way to demonstrate love to your neighbor.
Right.
It's possible. Like, I would say that, let's just take ourselves and put ourselves in mid 2020, when we were, let's say we already know that it's, it spreads, I guess it's aerosol or whatever, rather, as opposed to like it's on surfaces.
Correct.
Let's say we already know that, and we're like, all right, maybe the science is not really settled, whatever that's not supposed to be a thing anyway, right? So like, whatever the consensus is, masks probably work. Okay, fine. I can see that if you go into a nursing home, which you probably wouldn't be allowed to in 2020,
Right.
you go in to see your grandparents or your elderly parents, or somebody who is, has what would be comorbidities, health issues, whatever. Like, you could see yourself saying, I'm going to make a decision in this particular case. The impulse, however, is that most people want to say masking in public is the way to be loving, as opposed to being deliberate about when you mask in public. I have refused, except for when I had to go to Hershey Park and wear a mask outside, except at the water park, which was really, really interesting because it wasn't less crowded there. Except for when I went to Hershey Park in 2020. I refused to wear a mask outside. I absolutely would refuse to. And that's about the only extent of refusal that I did, because honestly, I was just like, you got to be kidding me, right? Like,
So you're saying
6 feet away.
You only refused outside.
I only refused outside. And I personally, and again, I'm not endorsing a particular way of being with respect to whether or not somebody should mask. When required, like when I flew in 2020, 2021, I had to, wear a mask in the airports to get on. Even on airport property while we were outside, I didn't wear a mask. But if I was asked to, I did. And there are some private organizations and churches that required masks and still do in some respects. And so what I do is I just cleverly choose to not wear it in a way if I can. And so I've navigated that a little differently. I'm a little bit more compliant than some other people who, I only know a couple people who pretty much refuse to wear masks the entire time in public near people. And what they do is they just haven't done it. Right. And so my life circumstances are such that it would create bigger problems for me to not sort of comply in those ways. And honestly, I would say, to my defense, it would be something like the idea of meat sacrifice to idols. Look, if you think masks are protecting, if you think my mask is protecting you, and even if I give you the benefit of the doubt that it does, it's really not a big deal for me to put this on for 15 minutes while we're in a meeting for my kids, whatever. I'm not going to reveal places that I've been that way, but but back to the like loving your neighbor stuff. It's like, well, wait a second. If you step back a little bit and you ask yourself, and this is in some ways, I think the libertarian take, and I think the more Mises-centered libertarian angle on this, is that we're highly skeptical of authority, and we're highly skeptical of people in authority who seem to want to have that authority. So you have mandates, guidance, whatever wording you want to say, by the federal government, right? And if it didn't come along with shutting down dissenting information, or as apparently Justin Trudeau recently said, there's something called unapproved opinion, which is really ridiculous and very alarming. If it weren't for the fact that those were also being done alongside the guidance that the CDC and everything was given, you would think that the state has some ulterior motives. And again, I don't want to venture into conspiracy theory territory here because there's only so much evidence to show that there are people in high places who want to control us, right? And there is a reasonable skepticism that we should all have as Christians and as human beings who care about other people, that when the state tells you to do something and it keeps telling you to do the same thing and it changes it based on updating knowledge, I understand that that's reasonable, that's legit, that can be legit, I should say. But then they close out dissenting information. I saw a Babylon Bee headline that said Joe Rogan is only going to be spreading CDC misinformation from here on.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, okay. When you are in an environment like that, I think it is very loving to your neighbor to question their decision to simply blindly follow.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you should be a jerk. You clearly should not be a jerk. I mean, come on. Come on, man. That's kind of the thing we got to say now, right? Come on, man. You shouldn't be a jerk about it. But when you don't comply with individuals, or group or institution or even state guidelines to wear a mask inside, or whatever situation that you're in, you're bringing up a challenge and you have to be ready for that. I knew when I refused to mask outside when everybody else was, that I have a particular setting in mind where there were a lot of people there and we were able to social distance during that outdoor situation, but I refused to mask. And if somebody would have told me that, I had answers ready as to why that was stupid. I wasn't going to call them stupid to their face. Now, if they're listening to this, they probably won't. But if they are ever listening to this, they can be like, did Doug call me stupid? No, I'm not calling you stupid, but I think the rule is stupid. So anyway, you have to be ready with an answer, and you have to also sort of have your thoughts in order with respect to how are you going to handle yourself when confronted. And that's a lot more difficult. I'm not a huge confrontational kind of person, but other people are. And if you become just belligerent and you become the kind of stereotype that tends to be on the left right now about people who refuse to vaccinate or people who refuse to wear a mask and whatever. Like if you're belligerent, you're just going to give those people a bad reputation. But if you're thoughtful and you build rapport with people, I think it can be well done.
Yeah, I mean, my policy is for the last 7-8 months here in Knox County, like almost nobody wants you to mask anymore. But the only time I've really even been asked in the last several months is that I went to the eye doctor, a new eye doctor, since I just moved here, and she just like handed me a mask, and I as politely as I could possibly be, because sometimes the look of me, I don't look polite, and or amenable. So I just said, "Hey, I'm sorry, I just don't wear a mask." And she's like, "Well, this is like a medical facility." Da, 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 da. I was like, "Well, I'm sorry to do this to you, but I'll just have to go somewhere else." And, I hated doing that, but, to me, if you respond that way, then it's on them as far as how they want to react. And, as far as, not that I'm trying to prove a point, but then maybe if they get upset, maybe at some point they'll question their motives as why did I get upset over that? But I just think I think it's a technique that is, pretty common in our society. It probably always has been, but especially with the topic that we're going to talk about in depth today, is positing these questions and framing issues in such a way that there's only one possible answer. And I think that's very disingenuous. Yeah, and I think it also shows the climate of sometimes people on the left say, well, there's no such thing as cancel culture. Well, if there's not, and we can debate what that means.
It's like a fish saying there's no such thing as water.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Because exactly what I was going to say, because all of these debate and rules around discussion, from, the Joe Rogan situation to, who's allowed to get on the news and all this stuff, it's basically all of it implies that there is only one set of approved opinions. I hadn't heard Trudeau actually use that phrase. That's awesome that he did. But so that's kind of what I want to get into, is how we as libertarians, primarily on this podcast, but also from a Christian perspective, how are we to look at the social justice, critical race theory stuff?
Yeah.
What's really behind it? How can we respond to it? Because I think to me, some of all that stuff reminds me a little bit of Marxism, because I think you can read like the Communist Manifesto and agree with some of his assertions as to what's wrong. But those assertions where there's some truth to it are then used to something, to justify something else. So there's on your bio on the site, there's a really good chunk, and I think I'm going to post this on the show notes page so people can see it, and just a link to your bio. But you said, but while I was on board with the social justice movement and its theology, I was very unsettled by the practical solutions being proposed by its advocates. So talk about that, coming from where you come from faith-wise, and then confronting this issue in the real world.
Yeah, well, I think what I'll do here is sort of tell my story of becoming a libertarian, which is, I don't think it's atypical, but it's probably not the standard line, although it does sort of transition with Ron Paul. So there's that. And it definitely involves the Mises Institute and Mises University and so forth. So back in, let's see, I started seminary in 2005. And so it was a little bit before that. Actually, I'll back up to 9/11 for a second. Just to sort of preface that I was a sort of conservative Republican just because that was what I inherited. And when 9/11 came around and George Bush, this good Christian man, was the president, 9/11 happened. And I don't know why, but I had this thought with all of this talk of, retaliation in some kind to whomever it was and wherever they may be, that if we were really a Christian nation, would we turn the other cheek? And that idea just was like, I talked about it with my, college dorm mates or whatever. And I honestly don't remember anything whatsoever about those conversations.
Yeah.
But I do remember thinking about that. And then it just kind of went away. I didn't really endorse the war. I wasn't really against it. It was like, well, it happened. And so therefore there's just, whatever it is. And I guess there's a good reason to go to war. When I got out of college, because I was in college at that time, when I got out of college, I started listening to like some of the talk radio, because I got XM radio, and that was kind of cool to like have XM radio, right? So I started listening to the right-wing news. I never listened to Rush Limbaugh, and eventually a coworker of mine who was like sort of libertarian, he's not really, he's really a conservative now, and he's sort of stayed that way. But I thought he was really into Glenn Beck, because Glenn Beck was local in Philadelphia at the time, and he was really funny. And he also, was a little bit into politics or whatever. So I started listening to Glenn Beck, and then Glenn Beck got bigger, went to CNN and then to Fox and had his own show. And so I listened to him a lot, and he kept talking about being a libertarian at heart. But then he would kind of be down on Ron Paul, except for things related to the economy. And every time I would hear Ron Paul come on the Glenn Beck show, it would be all about the economy. And I was like, interesting. At the same time, I started seminary. My theological beliefs were not as conservative as they once were. And I was reading, what we would probably call them now leftist theologians or writers or pastors or whatever. And I was like, wow, I really like what you have to say about the gospel, and how that it's not just about the afterlife, that there is something in the Bible, not just something in the Bible. The Bible is a document, is a book that doesn't just speak to what happens to you after you die. Like, there's way more to it than that. And that there is a lot of wisdom for living in life now. There's a lot of the gospel records Jesus being counter Caesar, which I'm sure we'll talk about here in a little bit. And so there was just a lot going on there, but it always jumped to, that's why we need universal basic income. Actually, back then they weren't talking about UBI, but it was more like, that's why we need welfare programs, or that's why we need to do X, Y, or Z, or use less fossil fuels, or that's why, whatever the reason is, pick your leftist laundry list of things that need a legislative laundry list. And those were the things. And I was like, this doesn't feel right. I like what you're saying theologically, but this doesn't comport with me. I'm like, this requires me to say to other people, you don't have individual value. You are just something for me to say, you need to do this to comply or to be part of this agenda. And in some way, it's almost like there was this like Christian nation mentality on the left. It's like, well, we need a nation that reflects the values of Christ. Okay, what does that look like? Oh, it means stealing from your neighbor to pay for other things.
Right.
No, not for me, not for me. So at that point, I was like, all right, looks like I'm going to need to learn economics. And I don't remember the very first book I read, but it wasn't by an Austrian. It might have been by a Chicago school person. And this was, again, leading up to the Obama election. So this is probably 2006, 2007. And eventually I came across the Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism, which is by Bob Murphy. No, wait, sorry, not capitalism. It was the New Deal and the Great Depression. That's what it was.
Yep.
Sorry, I just misquoted the book. But anyway, so Bob Murphy had all these like places and that would lead you to Ron Paul, the Mises Institute. I also was like, oh, hey, Ron Paul, he's a good guy because Len Beck really liked him, and so therefore I'll read some of his stuff. So I read a Revolution Manifesto. Started listening to Rothbard for a New Liberty. I listened to a lot of audiobooks. I listened to fee.org like classes that they did, their summer classes that they did when they were still up in New York. So I'm listening to all these via podcasts, via whatever downloads I could find while I'm mowing my yard, doing all this. So this is like 15 years ago or so. And this just felt right to me. There is a way in which we can achieve what one might call social justice ends without having to violate moral principles or biblical principles, or just for that matter, other people's respect and dignity.
Right.
It might take longer, but it's going to be more lasting, and sort of a truncated way for me to say that is something along the lines of, do you want to just have rich people paying for things that the poor, the destitute poor, not just under the poverty level kind of poor, although they're people too, right? And we should be concerned about that. But do you really just want poor people to have funds, or do you want rich people to care about the poor? Because which is, and again, those are two different goals. And I would even, I'm gonna turn in my libertarian card here for about 2 minutes. I would even go so far to say that if we have to make a trade of some kind, that it's temporary. Like we make an agreement that, okay, fine, we're gonna have this system where the poor are paid to, sort of get out of poverty, whatever that might look like. But don't tell me that this is just your system. Like this is your only answer. Dear leftists, don't tell me that you don't have any goals to sort of get rid of this plan, right? Mm-hmm. Like if you have a vision for what is the social justice ends, rich people are voluntarily caring for the poor in ways that you might find acceptable. But they don't want that because they don't believe that will actually happen. They need control. Right. Yeah. And so you and I would say, well, sure, if Elon Musk wants to give his money to, cure poverty. I mean, he even offered to the UN, I think, or the World Bank or whatever. He's like, hey, I'll give $8 billion. If that's all it takes, I just want to show me your receipts. Well, they won't do that, of course, because that's not really the way this works. And that's not really their motive. Their motive is control. And again, I don't like to attribute false motive to people. But when you become the kind of person who gets in the kind of position where your power is such that you get to control people, I have to be skeptical.
Yep. I want to get back to that point real quick about control and sort of the both political and theological implications of that. But first, let's define what the term social justice. Do different disciplines, different like it is in the theology world, which I'm not part of. I've never really studied officially. Is one thing meant by that community versus what another subculture? That I think there's a lot of issues that arise from that. I have a feeling, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, here's my cynical answer. Social justice is good things that happen in the absence of capitalism. That's sort of what they seem to mean. So I would say that and again, I didn't prep for that answer, but I can give you what I think my impressions are of the definitions that tend to come out. They want to see, and I'll speak from typically the Christian left. They want to see a world where people don't struggle for their basic necessities in life. Okay, food, shelter, the cell phone. I don't know what, like, those things can change, right? And we can talk about the economic developments in the past 50 years, but they want to see a world where that's not a problem anymore, right? They also want to see a world where the world itself, creation, the environment is such that it's not being harmed in a way that does. Well, it depends on who you ask. See, I'm already thinking in my head how I'm going to say this, which is basically an Alex Epstein-esque sort of answer, which is, how do I not harm the world so that it harms other humans? So they want to have a zero impact sort of thing with the world. They want harmony among people groups. They want harmony with the creation and with each other. They want harmony among nations. So shalom, this idea of peace, not just the absence of conflict, but that there is a wholeness to what is wrong with the world. And so they want to see all those things happen. What's interesting to me is the desire for those good things. I mean, Aaron, you and I both want to see those things too. I mean, right? Like, we don't want to see the environment damaged. All right. We don't want to see other people damaged by neglect, or even, for that matter, the results of their own choices. I don't want to see them damaged or broken. I mean, in an unhealthy, damaging way. But there are unhealthy ways to do that, and there are healthy ways. And I often allude to the idea of saying, well, you know what? There's a really terrible way for us to eliminate poverty, and that's to eliminate people who are poor. We're done. But nobody would go for that, because that's ridiculously evil, right? And so you can't. We already know that extreme example isn't there, but I don't think that people on the left realize that the problems they are trying to solve involve solutions that require more power, which is part of the problem that they say is creating the issues that they want to solve.
Right.
And so, I mean, there's so many libertarian articles out there on how the left is proposing solutions to the problem that are basically just going to exacerbate the problem.
Yeah.
I mean, I think pretty much any listener to this is kind of can see that with basic economic analysis. It's like, oh, hey, there's a supply chain issue because there's a whole bunch of ships off the coast of California. Well, let's just fine them for sitting there too long.
Yeah.
Okay. What?
Right.
Like,
how is that?
Some things are obvious, that kind of thing. So.
Yeah. So I think what it does kind of, one way to look at it is that the people who have that desire to help people, it breaks my heart to see the guy at the corner, when you pull up to the stoplight or on the exit ramp, begging for money. And if I have it, I give to those people. And some people, I try to do things. And I think that, I think some of these people who advocate for social justice, I'm sure a lot of them do volunteer and contribute and stuff like that. But I think when you do something like that, like as I am giving, money to the person we used to call a bum, but we can't anymore. But I always love how, changing terminology is supposed to make things better. Like he's not better off because I came up with a slightly more nice term. But when that happens, when I do give that, I'll also have this pang in my heart of like, oh, well, I wish I could do more. And so I think that the easy answer for people, especially people who have been brought up in the 20th century and in public schools, is, oh, well, just vote for something to do it. So they feel like, because we've been told that democracy, it's our responsibility to participate in democracy. So they're whether or not they're doing it on the individual level, I think they really feel like they're doing something morally right because they don't see it as taking from one and giving to another. Or if
they see it as their say in us doing this together.
Right. Yeah. That's I have a friend of mine who kind of jokingly says that that liberals or leftists kind of their view of government is the things we do together, right? That as if there's no other way to do things. So like, I guess, let's get back to that control thing. So and obedience. Like, it seems like a lot of these, well, that's another issue.
Yeah.
But some people like to obey, no matter how stupid the control is, as we found out the last couple of years. But let's talk about, like, how do we start to talk about solutions for some of these problems? And I want to get into like race and things like that later, but just in general, like, how do we talk about that to people, whether religious or not, who have that feeling that if I vote for something, if I advocate for something on social media, then I'm actually doing something substantive and moral. How do we start to make that case in a way that feels like not disingenuous to them? Because I think that some of the response to what we would say is, well, you just don't care and you just want to be left alone.
Yeah.
And I'm the serious person who wants to help people. They don't see how our solutions could actually lead to a better outcome. And I don't know what to do about that.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to say, and I think that's a really important question for a number of reasons. So I hope I don't ramble too much here about it, because it's really important. I think a key aspect of the solution to whatever problem you might have is to understand that there are things that you cannot control.
Mm-hmm.
And there are also things that you should not try to control. I understand that if it's within your purview to help your neighbor, your literal neighbor, the person over here next door to me, to do better, whatever that means, right? To to live better, to think more highly of people than they might, or just think more highly of people because it's better to do so. That whatever it is within my power to do, I need to focus more highly on that than I am fixing other people.
Mm-hmm.
Other people's problems are sometimes my problems, but they are not necessarily my problem to fix. I mean, I'm a parent and I have kids who, that's two ways of saying the same thing. And my kids, basically, sometimes I have to explain to them, what he's doing right now, you don't need to worry about. It's not part of your problem. Doesn't even involve you. It doesn't affect you in any way. Stay out, right? And there are other things that you have to say, oh, well, this is something we have to work on together. And that whole together piece is really the key. It's been a huge lie that we do things together, and the only way that we do things together, whatever that phrase means, it's come to mean we do things together through government. Now, at a local school board level, I think there's a lot of energy behind us doing this together and stopping certain things from being taught in local schools, right? Those things, you can come together and in a meaningful way govern, in a very generic sense of govern away or solve problems that don't involve the federal government, that don't involve the state government, or for that matter, even county and whatever governments between local and state, for wherever people are. So the number one, we want to make sure that we are solving our own problems first, keeping our own homes in order, because by example, we will lead. I don't remember the particulars of the conversation, but it had to do with immigration and refugees. And I was in a conversation on Facebook. I was in favor of relatively open borders, and they were like not in favor of this at all. And I was just like, wow, this guy just must hate immigrants. Well, that's not true at all. Part of his work outside, like part of the sort of labor of love they do outside of their work, was that his family, they house refugees and immigrants and help them get citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
But over on the other, so he was actually doing things for people, for the benefit of the people, just like I would want him to. But he was actually on the opposite side of the political idea of open borders that I'm on. And so you have to get to know the people that you're talking to, because sometimes they are individually handing out snacks to bums or whatever. Although I'll defend the people who want to change that, because if you don't want people to call bums, language creates, and so when you use words, it's just helpful for us to not think of them as bums. That's all.
No,
I know you were ripping on the whole in mentality, but which is totally true. Language matters, but I'll go with Bill Maher on some of these things. Like, come on, really? Right. Like, there's just a whole lot of unnecessary changing of things. But
there's a difference between a bum on one hand and economically displaced person on the other hand. Like, I think it goes the opposite. That's also dehumanizing to me, of trying to come up with something that is just so theoretically correct that Yeah. So.
Oh yeah, no,
Yeah.
I totally get it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I lost track of where I was heading with my. So the point was like,
I'm sorry.
solve the. No, it's all good. I did my own side track with that bum comment. So who's the bum now, right?
Yeah.
Fix your own house. That's kind of the first point that I wanted to make. The second thing I would say is teach people that not to be moral busybodies. That's a C.S. Lewis term that is pretty common, because moral busybodies seem to have pleasure in dictating what other people do and sort of setting about systems that create circumstances that somehow supposed to create a better outcome. And so if we can just meddle in people's lives, I simply despise people who want to meddle in others' lives. And it's not really about, I don't want them meddling in my life.
Mm-hmm.
It's really more about, it just feels creepy. It just feels wrong for others to meddle in each other's lives without permission. Right.
Yeah.
So we need to give each other permission. We need to give others permission to speak into our lives. And so we need to afford that. I mean, come on, golden rule, like, love. If you want to love your neighbor as you love yourself, does that mean that you want your neighbor to be a moral busybody about you and tell you all the things that you want to do? So we've become a society where that phrase "judge not lest ye be judged" it's kind of thrown out the window. I remember in the 90s, Christian or non-Christians would sort of say to Christians who want to be moral busybodies, well, Jesus said not to judge. And that's not really quite what Jesus meant. But like, no one wants to make that argument anymore because we all want to judge. We all want to make a pronouncement over every single thing that's in the world. Like, who cares? Like the Jen Psaki should not at all be commenting on Joe Rogan and Spotify's relationship and what he says.
Yeah.
This should not be the thing. Like, it's been over 100 years where we've had a president say that's not the purview of my administration or my role as president.
Yeah, I think that I really like your point about, it's not about myself being inconvenienced. Like, the stereotype is that all libertarians are, selfish Ayn Rand, clones or whatever. But like, what upsets me about the COVID panic and the government's response to it is not that like I said, I don't do it anymore unless I have something I absolutely essentially cannot get anywhere else. Like I did wear for a couple of medical appointments that I absolutely had to have, but it doesn't bother me of like, oh, that I'm so offended that this happened to me. It's when I hear about kids who are having to eat outside with their masks on, not talking to their friends at public school. It's when
they're not allowed to take off their mask for a Stacey Abrams photo op.
Oh, isn't that the most bizarre and grotesque? Like, and I'm not making a comment on her personal appearance, but on the fact that she is held up as this saint-like figure, and that nobody, the people on the other side of things don't see how dystopian and just like sadistic almost that is, doing that to children. I especially when they're, we could go down the list of reasons why. And so it does, like when I'm upset about the war, well, it's not because I'm upset about paying an extra, half of my taxes go to that, although I am. It's upset to me thinking that it goes to like, kill the children of Yemeni sheep herders, right? Like, like it breaks my heart over that. And I think that you're right, is that impulse for control. I think that's one of the worst things about, democracy, public schools, things like that, is because it does say explicitly that we all have a right to say something about someone else's life and do something about it, not just have an opinion. And once you open that, take down that barrier of respect for your neighbor, then everything's on the table at that point.
No, you're totally right. It's really sad to me. And along with that goes the value of free speech. It's not just what we do. Like I can kind of understand that we want that the mentality of somebody who wants to create a society where people are encouraged in some ways to make better choices, to care more for their neighbor voluntarily, and so forth. I can wrap my head around that. I cannot wrap my head around the rejection of free speech as a value.
Yeah.
I just can't. I don't know anything that is more damaging to our civilization than to abolish free speech.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty bold statement. And I think it was Jordan Peterson who kind of got me around to thinking how damaging that was.
Yeah.
Because if you abolish free speech, you are basically suppressing thought. And as soon as you do, I mean, come on, nobody, I keep saying, come on, Joe Biden has really negatively influenced me. Like, give me a break. What should I say from here on out, Aaron?
I don't know. If I come up with something, I'll let you know.
We have to do better with emphasizing the value of free speech. And part of that, and again, I'll point to the coddling of the American mind, which is Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, that it's really important that people understand how they can work through things that upset them.
Yeah.
And so loving your neighbor might mean helping, being the kind of person who is not just, run roughshod over people, but also to sort of help people on the other hand, to be like, look, something offended you. Well, why is that? Let's talk about it.
Yeah.
And it's not really like somebody says something to me, like, all right, like as a kid, people would tell your mom jokes and I'd be like, okay, like, it just never, I never found them funny.
Right.
Sorry, I found them funny. I never found them offensive when someone did it to me, because I'm like, well, I know my mom's not like that.
Right.
Like my mom doesn't have her own zip code because whatever. So it's really kind of dumb to me that people are offended by things that they don't have to be offended by, and it is a learned skill. It is something that you have to learn to cope with, and because I'm teaching my kids to do this. But on the other hand, I think it's important that we also don't just decide that free speech is license to say damaging things unthoughtfully. And for that matter, it's also okay to be challenged when you say damaging things without realizing it.
Yeah.
The super minor example, of course, is what we just talked about with being, calling somebody a bum. But I mean, it is possible, and I think we could probably lead this into the CRT stuff.
Yep.
It is possible that the critique about white privilege, the critique about how people are being in the world, creates circumstances and creates situations that people have to react to that might not be necessary.
Yeah.
I don't quite have anything in mind, but I can understand as a parent not realizing that I can do something that seems innocent and has no origin in anything malicious, causing a negative outcome that I myself don't even want. Okay. I have a recent situation in my family where, with a relationship with one of my children, where I didn't realize that what I was saying in good fun was actually damaging to their psyche. And that's a pretty grave way of putting it, damaging to their psyche, because people on the CRT friendly side are going to say, well, that counts as aggression. It's not quite that, although I'm sure there's a case to be made in some circumstances.
Yeah. Well, I think that's exactly what I want to get into with. I think that the critical theories, critical studies movement, which has been around for a while, is a deliberate attempt to weaponize social justice and to use it for for basically Marxist political aims, because it's very easy for them to say, like, I don't know, I think somebody asked Joe Biden about CRT, and he was like, hey, what's wrong with teaching your kids to be nice to other people? Right. So like,
because that's what CRT is.
Right. On the surface, it seems like that, but what it really is a tactic, call everything racist, sexist, homophobic, until you control it. And then you can be Stalin, But so I guess let's talk about kind of how that view of social justice, and I think some of those people are good-hearted, and again, they think, oh, this is a goal, and I have these smart people who are on TV and writing books and at universities telling me how to get to that goal. So I'm gonna buy into this. How do we show people, or how do we address the fact that what try to expose and open people's eyes up to the real motivations behind people who are, I think, weaponizing the desire of people to be nice and to have some sort of, degree of social justice. But really what it leads to is like explicitly a Marxist cabal. I mean, it sounds, stupid to say that, but that's kind of what it is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the first step would be for the two of us as white guys to step off screen and let only voices of color speak. Right. I say that sarcastically, and I don't want to risk it not being valuable.
Let me say this real quick. If I did have someone on like that, and I have in the past, then those people are attacked for having internalized all this stuff.
Oh no, I totally get it. You can't win when you're not speaking. See, that's the reason it's not really about race, because you have someone like John McWhorter, who is a black linguist, a linguist who is a black man. I don't know how I'm supposed to say it, because we all dance around all this. So I would say this. Let's bring it back to loving your neighbor. If you are the kind of person who is being weaponized in the culture war, okay, you are not loving your neighbor. Okay, you are being used as a weapon by power elites, by the CRT elites, whatever we want to call them. You are being used. Okay, if you are using race-related, sex-related, any critical study or intersectionality sort of relevant topic or agenda or aim or platitude or whatever you want to call it, if you are using that as a weapon, you are not loving your neighbor. Okay, loving your neighbor means putting down your weapons and loving your neighbor. Okay, so at the very start, we need to call people out on being weaponized or using something as a weapon that should not be weaponized. So if someone tells you or me that we just have no business talking about this, which, for me, by the way, I have a decent amount of good things to say about critical race theory. And if you listen to my interview with Phil Magnus recently on our podcast, you'll kind of get that sense. Like there's good things to say about critical race theory. The problem is, of course, like we talked about earlier, is the solutions that come along with them, or the assumptions behind the reasons why those things exist. No one's questioning that there's economic disparity. Nobody's questioning that there are, libertarians of all people know that we need criminal justice reform. I read a book last year giving critical race theory sort of a fair shake by reading one of the two authors, Richard Delgado and Stephanie, actually I can't remember the last name. Stefanczyk is the last name, but I can't remember the first name of the woman. Called Critical Race Theory. It was like an introduction. It's like a 100-page book. It's not very long. It's by two people who are in the movement, so it's not like two white guys writing about it, right? And I gave it a fair shake, and I'm reading through this, and I'm just like, well, it's just explaining what critical race theory is in as neutral a way as possible, and I think it was pretty good. And I'm like, yeah, I totally get that there are judges who make decisions that are colorblind, that actually have a disparate outcome to black people. That doesn't faze me in a bit, doesn't surprise me in the least. But the answer is not illiberalism, right? Like at heart, I'm still a liberal in the sort of classical liberal American Revolution sort of sense, like all people are equal, free speech, all those kinds of things. I think everybody watching this would kind of understand what I'm saying there. Liberalism is going to work far better than whatever critical race theory has up its sleeve as agenda items, because it's based and grounded in reality. It's based and grounded in principles that are moral and treats other people with dignity. If you see everything as power dynamics, you are looking through a distorted lens. That's a helpful lens to look through. Just like we put on different sorts of glasses for reading, for computers, for taking pictures, for, bird watching, whatever. We use certain lenses to get us insight into other things. critical theory is not unhelpful. In fact, it has a lot of good to say, but it's not just a matter of like, oh, we need to learn American history and be taught that, the ancestor of the black girl was sitting beside you in class was a slave to your great grandfather, which is almost never probably the case. In many circumstances, especially in the North. And so it's very, very different. The concepts around critical race theory, and again, I'm not an expert by any means. I've done a little bit of study, and I know enough to know when the wool's being pulled over my eyes. Is that it has good things to critique, but it's got terrible solutions and terrible explanations for why those things need to be either abolished, changed, modified, reformed, whatever.
Well, let's talk about that. Like, one of the things that I really think they're doing, and I hate it to say this because it does sound like, Pat Robertson, Ralph Reed, Pat Buchanan, whatever. And not that those people are all bad, but they're not that great.
Yeah.
I really do think that, the nuclear family and things like that, that's their ultimate goal, because there are still
Like
things,
to tear it down and to make it irrelevant.
right, to make it irrelevant.
Yeah.
So that's not a source of identity and belonging to people, that they have loyalty to their family, and by extension, their maybe their cultural group or their town or something like that. But I think that I forget the term that James Lindsay talked about it on Rogan here recently, but basically wanting to have the people always having these shifting, never defined identities. And like the fact that I'm married to my wife and that I take that seriously and I don't mess around with other women, and all of my decisions, like I do things that I don't want to do because I love my wife. Like, that is a core part of my identity. And there are certain things that if the government told me to do, I wouldn't do because of my loyalty, my covenant, my commitment to her. And I think that, if you can get to that point where people will, and we've seen it a little bit with COVID, of people disowning family and saying, F you, you're not coming to Thanksgiving unless you're, triple boosted. I really think that that's where that Marxist, leftist, like, again, I think the smart people who are evil and want power are taking a lot of good-hearted people and taking a critique that has some valid things to it. Like, nobody would, I think, dispute the fact that in some circles, like a black lesbian poor woman has it worse off than I do. But in certain, in higher education or something like that, it's it could be different. So I think that I think it's good that we somehow are able to acknowledge the truth in some of these criticisms, but try to call out the fact that these people are just, the good-hearted foot soldiers of all this are being used by people who don't care about, race or poverty or anything like that. Like, I think that a lot of this is, you see that the graph on certain catchphrases in the New York Times and other places, that after Occupy, that things like systemic racism is all of a sudden it's being talked about, because I think the global elites saw that the left was getting a little too close to central banking, and they said, oh, well, we need to come up with something. And I think this is a way specifically to divide people and to unmoor them from the good things in our lives that give us identity.
I can't think of something more systemically evil than central banking, and yet they don't want to touch it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And like, if people talk about, systemic racism is systemic this, systemic injustice or whatever, I'm like, or some Christians might say things like social sins.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, yep. Central banking. Anybody?
Fiat
Nothing.
currency. Yeah.
Nothing.
Yeah.
I've even challenged some of the leftist people that I've actually mentioned in the past, and they're just kind of like, yeah, that doesn't seem like to be really the issue. And I'm like, really? Like, I don't know. Like, I'm guessing that most of the people who are in central banking aren't non-white. Like, I don't know.
Right,
Like, can't you go after them? Like, if you're going to go after white people, go after the central bankers.
Yeah. And even if they're not, like I have a friend who, I'm not going to give any more info other than to say he has a fairly high up job in a very well-known financial services company. And he's also like a good-hearted person who I think gets some of it, but doesn't get others of it. And he was talking about this company is like fast tracking a bunch of people who aren't, old white men, but those people are going to do the same things. They're not going to pick people who aren't online with the
Yeah.
company policy and the
Yeah.
whole thing. And you're right. Like if it amazes me that people who, have a view of, they will criticize rich people and all that, but their eyes seem to glaze over when you do talk about, like, central banking, and even if you just talk about inflation, that, hey, one of the best ways you can help poor people is to not devalue their money, because the fact that a pack of cigarettes costs $7 now instead of $4, like, yeah, maybe they shouldn't be smoking, but you're hurting their lives. Whereas the people at the very top and the people closest to the spigot of where the money comes out, they're affected the least by that.
Yeah.
And
yeah, the one exception has been somewhat this past pandemic, because at least even Ron Paul sort of made this, not concession, but like this comment in one of the debates, like, we would have been better off just giving everybody, checks instead of letting the Federal Reserve funnel money to the banks and bailing them out.
Yeah.
Right. Like, we would have been better off funding people directly, which is kind of back then in 2008, which is kind of what happened during COVID. It's like, the wealthy and more well-connected got more money. Okay, there's nobody's denying that, but like, the average person actually also got money for some of this, and yet it's like, this isn't free. And you and I were probably on Facebook saying, hey guys, you're gonna pay for this in about 2 years with higher prices. Well, here we are, and no one saw it coming.
Yep. There's actually something in your bio too that I wanted to get at. This is a good segue. So with questions about social justice swirling in my head, a still small voice said, if you're going to understand how to change the world, then you have to learn how the world works. And to do that, you need to learn some basic economics. And I think a lot of people who we want to reach would hear a statement like that. They hear economics and they think, oh, this person wants to get rich. So why is that not
or
what you're thinking of?
They're too nerdy for me. Like, they don't want to talk about things that are, yeah. I told somebody, a friend of mine who was a tutor, he was tutoring me in learning Greek for about a year. And he told me he wasn't interested in economics. And I told him, well, if you're interested in social justice, then you really need to learn some basic economics. Well, now he actually has. He even found the Austrian school, which is really nice. But and that was like 7 years ago. But anyway, that's a really tough one, because economics it can be a tedious exercise in monetary theories. And I think that's probably what turns people off, is that they understand it's about monetary theory. You might want to say, maybe I should say this differently, is we might want to say we need to understand how the economy works. Because, I remember the Peter Schiff book, How an Economy Grows and Why It Crashes, which is sort of a mostly text, but semi-illustrated, written in like 2009, 2010, I think. Book that was aimed at like adolescents and maybe teenagers, and it's pretty easy to read. And I'm thinking, oh, I don't have to learn economics. I don't have to get a degree. I don't have to take a class or anything like that. You and I are probably, we kind of gobbled that stuff up, or maybe we still do. But to understand how an economy works is pretty critical. It's sort of like saying, I want to help people who are being depressed and having zero interest in understanding how the brain functions, or understanding the chemical interactions that sometimes cause depression, or even, for that matter, the human relationships that cause people to react the certain ways, ways that they do. Right. So like, you can't say, I want to solve a problem, and then completely ignore the relevant field of study that would help them, that would help you get the kind of information, at least in some direction. And I would say, this is the Hayek quote that we all love, about the curious task of economics is to demonstrate how little they know to men, how little they know about what they imagine they can design. And the idea of design, of course, is like everyone thinks that we need to design an economy. And so if you think of economics, you think, oh, we got to design an economy. I have a friend who's a close friend of mine. He's a leftist, and he just like his personality is like designing systems. He actually works with me in business, and it's like wonderful because he has parameters and systems in place that like keep me in line because I'm all over the place, and so it works really well. But he also thinks that society should be that way. Should have some sort of order in that way. But with economics, you end up being shown that you are so significantly limited when you reach outside the nuclear family, when you reach outside small social groups. It's also one of the reasons why some of the sort of socialist looking things that we see in the scriptures, I don't think apply to modern day economies because they didn't have 300 million people economies in mind when they did those certain things. There's a scalability problem, and I think we shouldn't make the scriptures speak to things that it is only that it's not